A few years ago, Ruth Kamande became the face of Langata Women's Prison after winning the Miss Langata Women's Prison contest. And part of the reactions of Kenyans online was how such a beautiful woman could be behind bars. Her story was yet to reach the proper news and for people to understand what it is that she had done. Of course, there were some calls from some quarters that such a beautiful woman should not be behind prison. Well, that is neither here nor there. But this is part two of our Ruth Kamande story. Now, Ruth Kamande was charged with the offense of murder. She was accused of murdering her boyfriend, one Mr. Mohamed. In that case, the trial court, which was presided over by Justice Jesse Lesit, found her guilty and gave her the death penalty, which of course became a life sentence. However, she filed an appeal before the Court of Appeal, where she appeared before Justices Hannah Okwengu, Mohamed Wasame, and Jamila Mohamed. This is a review of that appeal and how the court made its decision. Of course, if you're listening to this first, you need to make sure you go back and listen to the other case that we've done, the part one, just to get a bit of the background and how we've gotten here. Now, it's important to note that when it comes to appeal, the court is asked on appeal to consider the decision of the court below it and to see whether it would have arrived at the same decision. The court is not meant to substitute its views with that of the lower court, but it's to look at that decision, look at the requirements that needed to be met, and whether all of them were met. Of course, it's important to state that at this point in the appeal, Ruth Kamande was represented by Professor Githu Muigai, Senior Counsel and former Attorney General of the Republic of Kenya. Now, the memorandum of appeal in this case, which was what was filed, the matters that were presented before the court, three issues were captured by the court. The first one was whether the prosecution had proved the charge of murder against Ruth Kamande. The second one was whether Ruth Kamande's defense was inconsistent with the finding of guilty beyond reasonable doubt. And the third was whether Ruth Kamande's sentencing was unduly harsh and failed to take into account her mitigation. Now, the first case is by the appellant, who is Ruth Kamande, represented by Professor Githu Muigai. And they began by stating that the criteria to be satisfied when you're dealing with a conviction for murder is that A, you have to show that there was proof of the fact and the cause of death of the deceased. 2, you have to prove that the death of the deceased person was a direct consequence of an unlawful act or omission on the part of the accused, which constitutes the actus reus. Remember, in part 1, we spoke about the mens rea and the actus reus, that the mens rea is the guilty mind, and the actus reus is the actual offense, the actions that were taken. These are just some Latin terms that are used in legal circles. And the third is that you have to show proof that the unlawful act or omission was committed with malice aforethought, which constitutes the mens rea of the offense. Now, Professor Githu begins by stating that it was not contested that the death of Mohamed occurred at the hands of Ruth Kamande. However, he stated that Ruth Kamande lacked the requisite mens rea to satisfy a conviction for murder. He submitted that the prosecution evidence failed to establish malice aforethought on the part of Ruth Kamande. According to him, Mohamed and Ruth were alone in the house at the time of the incident, and therefore, when the altercation arose, there were no witnesses to confirm how it started and how it progressed to completion. He submitted that Ruth Kamande, in her unsworn statement of defense, had confirmed the basis of the altercation, that she had been threatened and attacked, and that she had defended herself from imminent death. Now, Professor Muigai submitted that the trial court had relied heavily on the testimony of the landlord and landlady, whose evidence was contradictory and inconsistent. He stated they had arrived at the scene after the altercation had commenced, therefore they could not confirm how or where in the house the altercation began. Further stated that the two witnesses stated that Mohamed had repeatedly shouted out that he had been stabbed, but it was not possible to ascertain whether he was actually being repeatedly stabbed or whether he was merely repeating himself out of pain. He added that at no point did the two witnesses state that they saw Ruth Kamande stabbing him. Now, the lawyer further stated that Ruth Kamande did not have malice aforethought because she did not take the weapon from the kitchen, she did not commence the attack, and she had not shown any aggression towards Mohammed prior to being threatened. Now, on the evidence of the landlord, he stated that that evidence was illogical and contradictory. He explains that the landlord's testimony implied that throughout his peering into the window, breaking the window, running to and from the front of the house to get help and speaking to Mohammed, Ruth Kamande was merely standing there, frozen in time for several minutes, with her back towards him. He stated that it was pure speculation on the part of the landlord that Ruth Kamande was preventing Mohammed from getting to the door, and that with Kamande's back to him, it was impossible to ascertain Kamande's intentions. He stated that there was no communication between Ruth Kamande and the landlord to the effect that Mohammed was being prevented from reaching the door, nor was there any evidence that Ruth Kamande had moved or actively tried to prevent Mohammed from reaching the door. Professor Muigai also stated that the events unfolded in the manner assumed by the trial court, and the Ruth Kamande was truly of bad intent, because Ruth Kamande would have continued to stab the deceased, especially as her back was towards the landlord, and the landlord would have witnessed the actual stabbing. Alternatively, he submitted, the landlord would have somehow reacted to the presence of the landlord, such as preventing him from searching for the keys to gain entry, turning to see who was breaking the window, and or speaking, changing stance, dropping the knife, but none of this was said to have been done. So according to him, he says, why didn't Ruth Kamande react to the presence of the landlord? Okay. Now, further citing the contradicting testimony, he stated that the events alleged to have taken place during the incident were obscure enough to create reasonable doubt, stating that the statements of the couple were taken 2 weeks after the incident, in the presence of each other, thus allowing them to align their testimonies, and they had retained full access to Mohammed's home after the incident. Ruth's counsel submitted that their testimony was at the very minimum questionable. Now, on the question of the unsworn statement of defense, Muigai stated that it was possible that Ruth had stabbed Mohammed from a lying position, with Mohammed seated on top of her, and in a state of fear and panic, possible to have stabbed him severally in self-defense. Senior counsel Muigai submitted that the stab wounds were random and not around one location in a calculated attempt to kill Mohammed. Further, the fact that Ruth Kamande did not recall how many times she stabbed Mohammed lends credence to her state of mind at the time of the incidents. He stated that the witnesses had given evidence that they saw blood all over the house only once they gained access to the house. Therefore, it was very possible that once Ruth Kamande got the deceased off her, she panicked, ran out of the bedroom into other parts of the house, spreading blood all over the house. Further, in the public being able to access the crime scene, they may also have assisted in spreading blood around the home. Now, Senior Counsel Muigai as well tried to speak on the circumstantial evidence that inferred the guilt. He submitted that the prosecution had failed to offset the burden of proving the facts, drawing an inference of guilt, as there were clearly other coexisting circumstances that had weakened and cast grave aspersions on the prosecution's case, therefore allowing for more than one conclusion to be drawn. Now, while holding up the circumstances of the altercation as had been contained in Ruth Kamande's statement of defense, he submitted that a defense of self-defense can only fail where the prosecution is able to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the actions of the appellant were in no way self-defense. According to Senior Counsel Muigai, he explained that a number of prosecution witnesses had confirmed seeing Ruth Kamande's injuries, and some 2 witnesses confirming that she had sustained injuries inflicted by a sharp object, wounds that he asserted were consistent with the kitchen knife used and similar to those of Mohammed. He stated that Ruth Kamande had been admitted into Kenyatta National Hospital for 2 days and had also received post-HIV exposure treatment, and that the doctor confirmed that it was not necessary for there to be injuries when a person is sexually assaulted. The lawyer also submitted that the prosecution had failed to counter or to disprove the defense, which therefore stood uncontroverted and should have automatically precluded a conviction of murder. Now, it was also his case that the trial court had exhibited bias against Ruth Kamande. He stated that certain statements made by the trial court prior to analyzing the evidence established clear bias against Ruth Kamande. He stated that the court had concluded that Ruth Kamande was jealous based on the evidence of the sister who had only ever met Ruth Kamande for 1 hour, in disregard of the testimony of the maternal uncle that Ruth Kamande had been pleasant in all other encounters, and the evidence as well of the cousin who had welcomed Ruth Kamande into her home where they lived together for several months. Now, he also bemoaned the High Court's contention that Ruth held a grudge due to discovering old love letters in Mohamed's possession, failing to take into account evidence that they had resolved the disagreement the day it occurred, with Ruth Kamande cooking for Mohamed and watching a movie together before retiring to sleep, and Mohamed communicating the resolution in a chat message obtained from his phone. Now, on the contention that there was no AIDS control program card, he stated that the trial court disregarded the fact that the initial investigation officer had failed to collect other significant evidence from the scene. Most of what he collected was handed to him on the scene by another police officer. And in any case, the police officers had only visited the scene 2 weeks after the incident to collect evidence overlooked by the initial investigating officer. The evidence in the house has been tampered with, as the public had been able to access the house and the landlords had retained full access to the home during and after the investigation. Therefore, guided by Section 17 of the Penal Code, they submitted that the test applied to the defense of self-defense is a subjective test based on the facts and circumstances of the case. Senior Counsel Muigai's assertion was that Ruth Kamande had proved that on a balance of probability, she faced imminent danger, as Mohamed had numerously provoked her and they had a history of assault. He stated that in a state of shock, panic, and survival, Ruth Kamande had instinctively hit out and at that moment had been unable to weigh the exact measurement of her defensive actions. According to him, it was also common ground that an exact cause of death cannot be established without a post-mortem. Hence, the external examination undertaken by Dr. Johansen merely assumed the cause of death, but did not ascertain it, and it cannot be stated with precision that Ruth Kamande's actions were the exact and only cause of Mohamed's death. Now, on the sentencing of Ruth Kamande, he stated that the court failed to appreciate that there was jurisprudence on sentencing as had been established by the Supreme Court in the case of Francis Karioko, Muruatetu, and another versus Republic. Now, using the guidelines in that decision, he submitted that the sentence imposed was harsh and failed to appreciate that she was 22 years old, a first-time offender, had been willing to plead guilty to a charge of manslaughter before the plea bargaining process had been aborted by the prosecution, and that her character and record was that of a committed Muslim who had been studious and of upstanding conduct during remand, that Ruth Kamande had acted in the context of domestic and gender-based violence, and that she had made statements of remorse. Her conduct in remand had shown a measure of reform and willingness to adopt back into society, and that she was the sole breadwinner of her ailing grandparents and had pleaded for the court's leniency. Professor Muigai then urged the Court of Appeal to find that in totality of these circumstances, even if the conviction of the charge of murder was to stand, sentencing ought to have been adjusted to reflect the mitigating circumstances. Now, in response, Mr. Hassan, who was acting for the prosecution, stated that it was not disputed that Mohamed succumbed due to injuries caused by Ruth Kamande. The key issue was whether there was malice aforethought that resulted in his death. He stated that the prosecution had proved this to the required standard. The elements that constitute malice had been proved. 1, the nature of the weapon had been shown, the nature of the injuries, the conduct before, during, and after the incident, and the manner of use of the weapon. He asserted that the 23 stab wounds inflicted on Mohamed were a clear indication of intent and malice. He urged the court to dismiss the appeal. Now, the Court of Appeal considered the record and submissions, and first they began by looking at what the law provides, that the elements must be proved beyond reasonable doubt to secure a conviction for murder. The first one is that the death You have to show that there was a death of the deceased and the cause of the death. Secondly, that the appellant committed the unlawful act which caused the death of the deceased. And thirdly, that the appellant had harbored malice aforethought. Now, from the post-mortem report, the cause of death was multiple injuries and blood loss due to penetrating force trauma. According to Ruth Kamande's and sworn statement in defense, she said, "I then grabbed the knife with my left hand. He was sitting on me. I used the knife to stab him severally." Now, according to the prosecution witnesses, Mohamed and Ruth were the only people in the house. Therefore, there was no doubt that Mohamed's death was caused by the actions of Ruth Kamande. The Court of Appeal therefore found that the trial court correctly stated that the prosecution must prove that at the time the accused stabbed the deceased, she was motivated by malice and that she was not acting in self-defense as she pleaded in her defense. Now, on the elements of malice aforethought, the Court of Appeal was also of the view that the learned trial judge rightly took note that these are well set out in Section 206 of the Penal Code. The court also went to cite some of the decisions that have been held in Kenya. For instance, in the court of Bonaya Tutu Ipu and another versus Republic, it was stated that in determining a charge of murder, whether malice aforethought has been proved, the court must take into account factors such as the part of the body injured, the type of weapon used, if any, the type of injuries inflicted upon the deceased, and the subsequent conduct of the accused person. Further, in the case of John Mutuma Gatobu versus Republic, it was stated that there is nothing in the definition of malice aforethought that denotes the popular meaning of malice as ill will or wishing another harm and all the related negative feelings. Nor, for that matter, is it to be confused with motive as such. Our law does not require proof of motive, plan, or desire to kill in order for the offense of murder to stand proved, though the existence of this may go to the proof of malice aforethought. The Court of Appeal held that the trial court had correctly considered the evidence of the prosecution witnesses, especially the first on scene, towards determining whether Ruth Kamande had developed an intention to kill Mohamed. Now, while senior counsel Muigai had argued that there were contradictions and inconsistencies in the testimonies relied upon by the trial court, and that the prosecution had failed to offset the balance of to offset the burden of proving the facts that would draw an inference of guilt, as there were other coexisting circumstances that had weakened and cast grievous passions on the prosecution's inference, thus allowing for more than one conclusion to be drawn, the court was of the view that we believe that the trial court correctly considered the evidence that built a cogent and irrefutable picture of a person who meant by the action to kill. As clearly pointed out by the prosecution, the elements that constitute malice aforethought are that the nature of the weapon used, nature of injuries suffered by the deceased, the conduct before, during, and after the incident, and lastly, the manner of use of the weapon. Clearly, there is no doubt that the appellant inflicted the injuries that caused the death of the deceased. According to the court, the issue was whether Ruth Kamande intended to cause death of Mohamed in the manner she inflicted the injuries upon him. No doubt, she had inflicted 25 stab wounds upon her to the chest, hands, legs, head, abdomen, back, and shoulders. According to the prosecution evidence, the injuries were multiple and severe, done repeatedly, intending to cause grievous harm or death of the deceased. In the court's view, the nature of injuries suffered by the deceased and admittedly caused by Ruth Kamande was a clear testimony that Ruth Kamande intended to kill. Hence, the offense of murder was proved beyond any reasonable doubt in regards to malice aforethought. Now, the court also considered that senior counsel Professor Githu Muigai stated that throughout the inquiry, the authorities blatantly mismanaged the investigations and allowed for tampering of evidence. Further, that the testimonies of the witnesses were riddled with inconsistencies as to the events that had taken place. He had submitted that the trial court had overlooked these errors and discrepancies and substantiated its decision on circumstantial evidence. Now, when a court is confronted with allegations of existence of contradictions, discrepancies, and inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, it was ruled in the case of Joseph Maina Mwangi that in any trial, there are bound to be discrepancies. An appellate court, in considering those discrepancies, must be guided by the wording of Section 382 of the Criminal Procedure Code, whether such discrepancies are such as to cause prejudice to the appellant or they are inconsequential to the conviction and sentence. The court also looked at Njuki and For Others versus Republic, where they stated that where discrepancies in the evidence do not affect an otherwise proved case against an accused, a court is entitled to ignore those discrepancies. Now, the Court of Appeal stated that a trial court has a duty to reconcile discrepancies where any is alleged to exist, and where there is failure to do so, an appellate court has an obligation to reconcile them and determine whether these go to the root of the prosecution or not. The court sitting as a first appellate court in Josiah versus Republic reconciled discrepancies and contradictions that the trial court had failed to reconcile, resulting in a doubt being created in the appellant's commission of the offense charged, and proceeded to substitute conviction for the disclosed offense. Now, the court applying this to Ruth Kamande's arguments on the issue, her lawyer stated that members of the public were allowed into the home immediately after the incident, hence tampering with the scene before the police collected evidence. The senior counsel stated that by the time the investigating officer arrived on the scene on the afternoon of the day of the incident, crucial evidence had been moved, which was the knife, a Nokia mobile phone, and bed sheets. He further pointed out that the landlords retained access to the home after the incident, with police accessing the scene 2 weeks after the incident to retrieve additional evidence not previously collected by the initial investigation officer. Additionally, he also stated that while 2 mobile phones were collected from the scene, only one of them was sent for examination. The court said, "We find that the appellant has neither substantiated what evidence was tampered with, nor how such tampering compromised the evidence that was gathered by the police." Now, the other thing is that Professor Githu Muigai argued that the photographs of the scene taken by the police were damaged while in police custody and were therefore incapable of production in court as evidence. The court found that the trial court had actually dealt with this matter and recognized that those photos had been destroyed. However, it relied on the evidence of the witnesses. Now, one of the things Professor Githu Muigai stated as well was that the evidence of the landlord and landlady were taken in the presence of each other. The Court of Appeal was of the view that it is unclear what the import of this allegation is on the veracity of those witness statements. We find no reason as to why the 2 witnesses would corroborate each other's testimonies and to what end. We also find that this allegation was neither substantiated nor proved by the appellant. Now, on the apparent glaring disparities in the events leading up to the appellant opening the door to the deceased home, the Court of Appeal was of the view that the trial court had actually addressed this. Okay? This is what the trial court had said. PW2 saw the accused climb the kitchen sink and reach out for keys. There was inconsistency in the evidence of the prosecution on this point. According to PW2, in this case was a neighbor, the accused handed over the house keys to PW7, who was the landlord. PW7 and PW5, on the other hand, said that it was the police officer PW10 who ordered the accused to open the door to the house, which she did. That matter is, however, not in dispute, as the accused in her defense stated that she was ordered to open the house by a gun-toting officer, which she did. Just for purposes of listeners, PW means prosecution witness, all right? Now, the Court of Appeal considered that Professor Muigai pointed to the discrepancy in that PW2 and PW7 both testified to entering the home together with neighbors, while PW10 denied those facts. Now, with no submissions to substantiate the import of this discrepancy, the Court of Appeal said, "We find that it did not affect the case against the appellant, Ruth Kamande, and hence the trial court was entitled to ignore it." Another discrepancy pointed out by the Ruth Kamande was PW2's testimony that he had not seen her with any injuries, whereas in his statement, he had stated that she had seen her with injuries to her legs. The trial court as well considered the issue of those injuries sustained and found that the accused had no injury that could be comparable to the one suffered by the deceased. The patient had superficial injuries, was in no danger at all, and definitely, apart from ruling out any serious injuries on her, keeping her in hospital was superfluous. The Court of Appeal stated that the issue as to the injuries sustained by the appellant was exhaustively determined by the examinations of the appellant by the 2 doctors after the incident. Ruth Kamande had failed to substantiate how this discrepancy in the testimony had any effect whatsoever on the case against her. And they say that we find that the trial court was entitled to disregard it. Now, one of the things Professor Muigai stated was that the police visited the scene 2 weeks after the incident and found the doors and windows of the home in good condition. He alleged that this evidence contradicted the evidence of PW2 and 7 that they broke the windows in the kitchen and bedroom in an attempt to access the house and assist the deceased. Again, the court found he had failed to substantiate how this discrepancy had any effect whatsoever on the case against the appellant Ruth Kamande. Nevertheless, the court said, we had inclined to believe that PW2 and PW7 were being truthful when they stated that they broke the window in an attempt to access the property and assist the deceased. Indeed, in her sworn statement of defense, the appellant states that she saw a broken window. The other thing as well that Professor Githo Muigai stated was that when you look at the evidence of the police expert, the witness confirmed that the Samsung mobile phone he received for examination and from which he extracted the WhatsApp chat messages had a different IMEI number from the Samsung mobile phone produced as the exhibit. The court said, we find that the reason for the examination of the mobile phone was the extraction of the excerpts from the WhatsApp chat between the deceased and PW1. At no point has the appellant challenged the authenticity of the chat messages between the deceased and PW1 as produced in the report by the police witness from the Samsung mobile phone. We find that the discrepancy in IMEI numbers is a triviality and does not affect the case against the appellant, as it does not quash the veracity of the extracted conversation that the trial court subsequently relied on in its evidence. This is what the court said. Therefore, on the above findings of the alleged and reconciled contradictions, discrepancies, and inconsistencies in the prosecution evidence, we find that these were either well explained in other testimony, inconsequential, or adequately addressed by the trial judge. The court further went ahead to say that having carefully examined the evidence on record, we find the conclusion that the appellant Ruth Kamande violently, intentionally, and unlawfully killed Mohamed inescapable. On our own analysis, we find no fault and agree entirely with the learned judge's findings. Upon close scrutiny of the evidence adduced, the Court of Appeal said, we cannot but conclude, as did the learned judge, that the appellant's alleged defense of self-defense was unbelievable, given the cogent and compelling evidence of the prosecution witnesses. Now, the court as well just went into a little bit of detail on how to deal with cases of self-defense, and they cited a case of Victor Nthiga versus Republic, where the court stated that the principles emerging are as follows. Number one, self-defense is defense of self. It is a use of force or threat to use force to defend yourself, your family, or your property from a real or threatened attack. Self-defense is therefore a justification in the application of force recognized by the common law. Now, the law generally abhors the use of force or violence, but there are instances when a person is justified in using a reasonable amount of force in self-defense if they believe that the danger of bodily harm is imminent and that force is necessary to repel it. Meaning that the force must be necessary and that it must be reasonable. Okay? The other thing as well the court said is that it is not necessary, however, for there to be an actual attack in progress before the accused may use force in self-defense. It is sufficient if he apprehends an attack and uses force to prevent it. The court said the danger the accused apprehends, however, must be sufficiently specific or imminent to justify the action he takes and must be of a nature which could not reasonably be met by mere pacific means. Finally, what amounts to reasonable force is a matter of fact to be determined from evidence and the circumstances of each case. The Court of Appeal finalized this matter by saying that the trial court properly considered the law and evidence and rightly rejected the appellant's plea of self-defense. Accordingly, we find that the appellant's conviction for the offense of murder was within the confines of the law. What about the sentence? The court says that in regards to the sentence meted out on the appellant, the trial court addressed its mind to the mitigating factors in line with the Supreme Court's decision in Francis Karioko Muruatetu and another versus Republic. We see no reason to interfere with the same. The upshot of the foregoing is that we find that the appeal before us lacks merit and it is accordingly dismissed. This judgment was delivered on 6 November 2020 by Justices Hannah Okwengu, Mohamed Osame, and Jamila Mohamed, of the Court of Appeal. Now, since then, there have been some developments in this matter, one of them being that Ruth Kamande has now appealed to the Supreme Court through her lawyer, senior counsel, Githo Muigai, and they have been allowed to take an appeal to the Supreme Court, and we'll be keeping our eyes open on this decision and the outcome of the same. Thank you for listening in. This is V for Verdict.